are we living through a revolution in military affairs, or are we seeing just incremental changes, many of them kind of tactical significance, but not accumulating to a larger transformation in terms of war? And the other one is, which is very closely linked to that, is which of the Ukraine lessons are relevant to other people and which ones are confined to Ukraine or indeed to a particular time and space inside Ukraine. And I think those debates are completely unsettled right now.
Ukraine and war. We have on today Rob Lee of FPRI, a former Marine, Shashank Joshi of The Economist, and Tony Stark of Breaking Beijing and the now dubbed Sports Center of War podcast, Second Breakfast, that we've been doing over the past few weeks. Thank you to the Hudson Institute Center for Defense Concepts and Technology for bringing us this show. Let's start off with this fact question mark that has been turned into a talking point for many defense tech fundraising slide deck. The idea that 70% of casualties on the battlefield today are caused by drones.
I think it's useful to look back at all the statistics and facts and kind of commonly held assumptions about the war and kind of, question whether or not these things are always true, whether or not they change, what is the source for them originally, because it can have a strong anchoring effect about, our views on modern warfare. When I went to the front line in July and August, I went 3 times for a week each and went through pretty much most of the front line. And I probably spoke to more than 15 battalion or brigade commanders or chief of staff or S2 for brigade. And I asked the same question to every one of them. What is the percentage of casualties from UAS right now? And the range that I saw was 75 to 95%. So 80% was the median, was the most common. That's the number that senior Ukrainian officials are mentioning too, like Pavel Polisa. That's the figure he's providing. But 80% is the most common figure. Although I would say, I think two of the people I spoke to mentioned, they kind of said, you can't differentiate between artillery and UAS because they're complementary. And so in many cases, artillery is important for destroying tree lines, so then UAS can come in and can drop grenades because the vegetation's not there. Artillery has a role in canalizing Russian units. So Russian infantry will avoid big fields when they can. They'll maybe walk along tree lines, and then you can have UAS drop, mines in certain areas, and they're going to canalize them in that kind of direction. Even the kind of elite UAS strike unit commanders, none of them think that artillery is up. So we feel kind of really praise the role of artillery. I think it's really significant. There's also like a psychological effect too of having 155 or 152 land near you. It's a really not very fun feeling. So two of the guys said at least I can't give you a number. Like, yes, it's over 50%, but artillery plays such an important role. It's kind of wrong to only look at this. And so, my view is that that's probably accurate, but we're probably somewhere in the majority casualties on both sides are coming from UAS. What is the specific number? I think it's probably impossible to come to in perfect terms. Most Ukrainian commanders thought that their casualties were, in that area too, like 75, 80% from the ones I talked to. I would say brigade commanders are not seeing all casualties. Obviously, there's some casualties that happen outside of brigades. And obviously, they don't see all the casualties on the Russian side because, HIMARS strikes might lead to casualties, and that's, beyond the kind of brigade area of responsibility. But I think it's a pretty good estimate. I also think because Russia's adapted to infiltration tactics, they're often moving with 1 or 2 soldiers at a time. And frankly, it doesn't make sense to use artillery on 1 soldier at a time. It makes sense to kind of bring in an FPV, to bring in a Mavic to drop a grenade. It doesn't make sense to use artillery. And so the nature of the fight is, at this point, I do think, 80% as a kind of approximate figures is probably about right. But one thing I'd emphasize about drawing too much from that number is that that is also dictated by the specific nature of the fighting in Ukraine, right? So the infiltration tactics, the adoption of kind of dismounted small-scale infantry assaults, that's why UAS is playing a bigger role. When you have large-scale dismounted infantry assaults, artillery is the main killer. And so I talked to the deputy S2 for one of the battalions that was in fighting the North Koreans in Kursk, and one of the things he told me is that basically the first few days when North Koreans assaulted, there's so many Russian ISR UAVs overhead, they couldn't really use artillery effectively. They're essentially suppressed because of the threat from them. But once that changed after the first few days and they started using artillery again, they really inflicted very heavy casualties on the North Koreans. And that kind of that forced the North Koreans to stop moving from platoon size attacks to maybe squad size and smaller. And so I think it's important to keep in mind if the next war that we fight or NATO fights, UAS will not necessarily be the main killer. It won't necessarily 80% casualties. I think most likely it'll be artillery again in the beginning of a war if we see a large scale conventional war. And I think that again, we're at year 3.5 of this war. Things have changed dramatically. But I do think that the commonly held view is that 80% or so of casualties are coming from UAS at this point. I had one brigade commander in particular tell me he estimated summer of 2023 that it was like 90% of casualties from artillery, and he now thinks 80% of casualties coming from UAS. And so that kind of significant shift is quite it's quite something important that he noted. But I think this figure is probably accurate for a variety of reasons. Although I do think it's important to always try to poke holes in these things and say, are we sure of this? How confident can we be, and how much will this apply to future conflicts?
We had an essay a couple of months ago by General Zaluzhny, who of course was commander-in-chief of Ukraine's forces until 18 months ago. He's now closer to me. He's in London than he is to Rob sitting in Ukraine. So we should take that with a pinch of salt, of course. But if you go to his office, there are banks of video screens on which he enjoys playing out drone strikes from Ukraine. So he's clearly still very digitally plugged in right to the front and is observing that. And in his essay, and I've seen the English version, Rob can translate more accurately, I'm sure, but he says, as of today, the use of strike UAVs accounts for almost 80% of personnel and equipment losses. So Zaluzhny himself is clearly going with the 80% figure, though, Rob has been in touch with the field at a granular level, so we must always remember that. And what Zaluzhny says is, he goes even further than that. His view of the war, I think, is not one I always agree with, but what he writes is the means of protection used in the previous period, such as fortifications, equipment, armor plating of combat vehicles, even individual armor protection, are negated by the scale of use, lethality, and accuracy of modern UAVs. And I just think it's interesting that someone who has had that bird's eye view of the conflict has arrived at that conclusion. But I completely share Rob's point that it's a big mistake to give that figure without looking at the role of UAVs in facilitating other types of operations. So, for example, even when you have artillery strikes, the observation is going to be facilitated by UAVs. And then, on top of that, looking at how UAVs in the other direction, as Rob says, can facilitate artillery strikes. For example, his example is canalizing troops by forcing them in a particular direction through mines. So, I mean, the way I would phrase it is the way I think we've been looking at it for two or 3 years, which is that these are symbiotic means of firepower, and that UAVs and artillery are symbiotic. But it would be a big mistake to ignore the context, which is what Rob is saying.
When we're talking about casualties here, are we talking about, particularly for vehicles, are we talking about catastrophic kills? Are we talking about just disables? Like what is the modern FPV capable of?
Sure. So at this point, again, employing armor is just very difficult, and it is UAVs that are the main problem. And I think early in 2023, the hype I think got a little too strong, where FPVs were very much a kind of new, immature technology. How to employ them wasn't very clear. There weren't that many frequencies, so you couldn't employ too many close to each other because there'd be signal interference problems. And there are all sorts of issues. And I think people kind of went a little too far. I think FPVs are now kind of more mature capability, where it's now been more than 2 years. Where you have crews who've been doing this for more than 2 years, who have significant experience. In terms of vehicle loss, it depends, right? So I had friends who fought in Kursk, and when he's repelling the Russian assaults in that direction, those DDV naval infantry ones. Javelins actually played a big role. So a lot of the kills were actually from javelins. That was quite surprising because the Genoa's done at much greater risk or at greater range. But I would say, typically, and obviously we don't see armor assaults that often now. We're seeing some right now in the Dorpilli direction because the weather's gotten worse. And so because we have overcast weather, ISR UAVs can't fly as often. And so that's why Russia's kind of trying to take advantage of that right now before winter sets in. But in many cases, it is UAS, right? It's a combination of remote mining, FPVs, or night bomber UAS. And this is another issue where I think social media can be distorting. So, one of the really famous units in Ukraine, not famous, but famous now, is the Lazar Group. For a National Guard, it is the best night bomber UAV unit in Ukraine. And they have something like 90 crews, extremely well led, very, very good targeting cycle. It's very, very well run. They, from their internal data, They have damaged or destroyed 2,000 tanks, more than 3,000 BMPs or BTRs, a significant number of artillery. In June, they accounted for, they destroyed more artillery than the next like 4 or 5 units combined, essentially, for UAS units. But they don't post any videos except until now. And so what they've been doing, they operate mostly at nighttime because the UAVs are easier to shoot down at daytime, but they have destroyed a significant number of armored vehicles, but you don't always see this because they're not posting videos. And so sometimes Russians will post videos afterwards of seeing a destroyed tank. But what it also did is it led the Russians to adapt. So Russians had to keep their tanks further behind the front line at nighttime. They kind of learned over time about this. But it's a significant form of losses too. And, in terms of an armor assault right now, the couple of videos that happened like the last 2 weeks, it's mostly FPVs or mines dropped from UAVs. But that's I think it's very clearly well over 50% of the armor losses come from those two things. But I would say the different anecdotes are so important here. So 20th Mechanized Brigade, they faced two turtle tanks back in May that did an assault. And they're very well made turtle tanks. The brigade is former Wagner guys who really go into do a lot of effort about it. I talked to the brigade about it, and it took more than 60 FPVs to stop these two tanks. And actually, the first tank was not stopped by the FPVs. It was stopped because the gearbox blew up. And so they basically, it had its own maintenance problem. That's what led to it stopping. But the UAV commander told me, it's like, look, if that had not happened, the tank would have made it to a front line. Like, it was that well built. We had enough problems kind of stopping it. And there's a video of the tank afterwards. It shows a bunch of FPVs that got stuck in the kind of like wiring outside of it. So that it can still be effective. But I would say at this point, it's very much the majority is coming from UAS in terms of countering vehicles, as well as infantry at this point.
There's a lot of commentary back here about, how battlefields are transparent, which, I largely disagree with. But how do you conduct surprise at the tactical and operational level, given those circumstances?
So the last time there was real operational surprise was the Kursk offensive. And I mean, Kursk is very interesting for a bunch of reasons, but the operational score was very tight. And, my understanding of how it went down, so General Sirski led it himself. He took direct command of it. The brigade commanders had to sign NDAs. So when he brought in the first two, they had to sign NDAs. And I think it was the 82nd Air Assault, also the 80th Air Assault Commander. I think the 80th Air Assault Commander said no. He said something to this where he was replaced and someone else replaced him. But they were told they were not allowed to tell their superior air assault forces. Their subordinates were not told. They're kind of being told to move up there. And a reconnaissance was done. I think it was very compartmentalized. So a lot of lessons for us about how to do this, but also what you can and can't tell subordinates about going into offensive. I think most of the soldiers who were moved up to Sumy thought they were defending. They thought it was like, hey, we were actually going up to defend, not to do an offensive operation, and then kind of they did that plan. But look, that was the last time we've seen a real breakthrough, and Russia didn't have strong UAS capabilities up there, right? You had obviously units that were not that well trained. You had conscripts, and they built good fortifications, but they weren't necessarily tied in. They had a bunch of other issues. Since then, we've not seen a real offensive breakthrough. We haven't really seen much success on either side. Ukraine has done some attempts, right? They attempted Belgrade in, I think, March to relieve pressure on Kursk. They did an operation in Chotkino and Kursk, I think, in April as well, with some of the best, assault units, the 225th Assault Regiment, the 425th, and some others. And it ran into really significant issues there. So, without surprise, it is very difficult. But of course, it comes back to neither side can achieve air superiority. If they can't really leverage aviation effectively enough, can you set the conditions for breaching well-defended or well-fortified defenses? So, and thus far, we haven't seen that. But my view is that I think it comes back to really being able to degrade, suppress, destroy, UAS teams. And I think the reconnaissance aspect of it and the fires aspect is really a key part of it. Both sides are making that a big priority. But neither side has kind of gotten good enough to really set conditions for anything, much more than kind of taking a village or a kind of small-scale tactical assault. I think I went on a wrong tangent there. You're asking about surprise, right? So I think it's difficult, but I know that both sides know that their soldiers will call home. Both sides will have staking capabilities. They listen in on the conversations. Sometimes commanders will lie to their soldiers and say, "Hey, we're getting rotated off in front line. We're going this direction, that direction." They do it deliberately, so the other side will hear it. That happens to both sides. There's a lot of deception efforts that are important. Everyone has a cell phone too. That's another thing, is where you can't really prevent people having cell phones. You have to kind of have preventative plans of assuming they're going to have this. So it is very difficult.
Because they need it to be told what to do, or because, I mean, it's 2025. You can't send someone anywhere without a cell phone.
So, I mean, cell phones they're used for communications. They're used for military style communications, probably to an extent that people would not want to acknowledge. But, and again, this is on both sides. You can see if you go to command post, you'll see Discord up, Google Meet. I know of guys who use Google Meet to talk to a drone pilot, right? And during a firefight. So all these things are leveraged. Telegram plays a very big role on the Russian side. It's a way of getting around kind of their communications issues. So there's, again, a lot of this is stuff that I've only scratched the surface on. I know part of it. I don't know the full story. But there's all sorts of very interesting kind of facets of this. But I think both sides are also scaling up the SIGINT capabilities too. I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently about it, but it's very clear they pull in a lot of information and data. And a real big priority too now is how can you sift through all this data quickly and actually make it, somewhat actionable. And I think that's going to be a big thing going forward with AI, with machine learning, is how you can go through intelligence to kind of, or information, and kind of make it into intelligence.
On just one word, Jordan, on the deception side, if you go back to sort of D-Day and think of deception for the Normandy landings, the cardinal principle of deception has always been, it is much easier to persuade an adversary of what he already suspects than trying to kind of introduce some completely new idea. And with Kursk, I mean, Rob will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think reinforcing the idea that Belgorod was the real target of Ukrainian efforts made it that much easier to undertake that deception. And that was incredibly useful. But I think deception's just an amazing subject to think about, because it is in some ways so much more difficult to do, right? The sort of false chatter on your comms is an age-old technique that you can always do, but you have to deceive successfully along all the channels of communication you have. So if you just deceive on your cell phones, that's not good enough. You also have to make a Belgorod operation appear real on all the dimensions. And there's it's a complete tangent, but Jordan, I know you like reading very widely. There's a great essay that R.V. Jones, who was who was a great wartime British scientist,
Wizard War. What a classic!
The Wizard War, and he wrote. He gave a lecture at CIA headquarters in 1993. I guess he must have been fairly old at that time. Called "Some Lessons in Intelligence," and it's a fantastic reflection on the nature of modern deception, taking lessons from World War II, but how do you actually apply them to a new conflict? So it's a really, really interesting essay. I encourage everyone to look at.
I think that kind of leads into my next question to Rob, of just like why we still have humans doing so much stuff. I remember, I think it was Mike Coffin asked you, where are the drone swarms that were promised? We've talked already about, the fact that you have these like UAS teams and like people, on their Xbox controllers, like driving these things into the places. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of this stuff that, I don't know, hypothetically within the next 5, 10, 20 years, like could be abstracted away from humans. I mean, I've sort of been puzzled with you and Shashank writing about, when we have these infantry who are staying on the front lines, like alone for 200 days and they're told not to shoot when people cross them. Like, why are they even there in the first place? I mean, where do you see sort of like human beings being sort of replaced sooner and maybe later when it comes to what you're seeing on the front?
I've been hearing people say we're gonna have swarms like this year, so the last 2 years, and there's a Ukrainian company called Swarmer that's working on this. I mean, there's a Wall Street Journal article about them a few months ago. I don't know the full extent of how successful they are. So I know that, there's often a lot of talk about AI in this war, but AI is often, I think, a misnomer, because in many cases, with FPVs, there's a form of kind of terminal guidance where you can kind of, once you have the FPV as a camera on something, you can kind of click a button and it will more or less follow where that target is. And it's as accurate as the pixel is on the camera. And that will mitigate if you lose the video feed at the, could last, 300 or so meters. I wouldn't call it AI, but people sometimes call it AI. I know there are attempts at trying to improve UAV's ability to kind of read terrain. So to read terrain, they can target direct target recognition on their own. They don't need a man in the loop for those kind of things. I think what they're aspiring to is being able to send a UAV into a grid square and it can just locate turrets on its own. I don't know how soon that's going to be. In some ways, it's less important because now for Ukraine, it's mostly about infantry, right? It's mostly targeting Russian infantry. It's one guy, two guys at a time. You don't necessarily need sophisticated AI for these kind of things. It's kind of less important unless you're seeing, massive kind of armored columns. And with armored columns now, if it's only one at a time, all these kind of UAV units on that part of the front line can kind of mass their, FPVs to kind of counter it. So I don't know when it's going to happen. I mean, I don't think we should assume infantry are going to be out of their jobs anytime soon. You still need someone on the ground to hold things. As you said, it is an interesting point about, with Ukrainian infantry, because they're often told not to engage Russian infantry unless they have to. It is a question about, what do they actually hold? What is the front line? To what extent is there something that's real? And are these guys actually an observation post, even though they're not really observing? They're not really, fighting it all the time. It's a question of kind of exactly what is their role exactly? How do we describe that? And it's not fully clear to me exactly how we describe it. And honestly, one of the problems the last few months is the mapping, the maps we use for OSINT are increasingly less accurate. And it's not because the mappers are worse. It's because with infiltration tactics where guys are walking 10 kilometers past the front line, it's very unclear what does a geolocated reference mean? Does it mean they're actually holding it? Does it mean they dropped a flag there? Because oftentimes the Russians will drop a flag from a UAV. They'll post it publicly, so their commanders will think they advanced further than they did. And Ukraine does that too, actually. So there's a lot of these kind of aspects that are difficult. I would say I don't think we're anywhere near getting rid of human beings. And one thing we've seen throughout this war, like most wars, is just a constant innovation and countermeasure, adaptation cycle. So something will come up. Maybe EW is part of it, maybe not. But there is a lot of work on creating mesh networks, on training, creating UGVs, UAVs that can operate and kind of bounce signals off each other. I've heard people who are kind of skeptical of that. Part of the issue right now in Ukraine is that there's only a few kind of companies that make radio signals that are strong enough to create a mesh network, and they're very expensive. They're very low quality, like Silvus. So it's kind of cost prohibitive to do this. And then there are a bunch of other adaptations, like using cell towers near the front line to kind of improve kind of 3G connection for things. So anyway, I don't know is the short answer. I'm not sure where we're going to go with this. I suspect manned aviation is still going to be important. I think infantry will still be important. And when you talk about using UAVs and UGVs, one thing to keep in mind is these are still very manpower intensive activities. So, normal FPV team is 4 guys, and you have to constantly rotate guys out. And UGV teams, similar number of guys, you have 4 guys, maybe more. And when you talk about these operations, when Ukraine does assaults, like I talked to one of the assault units, the way they do task organizations now, for an assault group of 4 to 8 guys, they will have an FPV team in support of them, a night bomber UAV team in support of them, and 2 Mavic teams in support of them. So you have 4 UAV teams in support of a 4 to 8 man team. So the ratio of UAV kind of guys in UAV units to infantrymen in those cases is like 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. And I think that's one of the big questions going forward is what does that ratio look like for us? It's not clear to me exactly what the perfect ratio is. It's a bit difficult too because right now Ukrainian brigades are almost all just defending, right? So they're focused defensive. They've been doing this for 2 years. Not many units have much offensive experience anytime recently, and technology's changed quite a bit. So a lot of this kind of stuff is really significant questions about what should things look like in the future. But, seeing some similar adaptations of both soft side and the infantry side, where they're compensated by having more UAV operators than infantrymen in a lot of these operations.
Why does it take 4 people to run a drone team, and why do they have to? Why can't they be 1,000 miles away?
So they can be 1,000 miles away. The pilot can be 1,000 miles away. That's one of the unique things, right? So obviously, Operation Spiderweb that was conducted from pilots who are not in Russia, and that was conducted all across Russia. So you can think about the implications of that. The Lazar group, their pilots operate from Kyiv, and they have teams that deploy the drones at the front line. And so again, hundreds of miles difference between them. In reality, we could have pilots in America piloting UAVs in Ukraine right now if we wanted to. And I'm sure there'd be some very interesting legal implications of that. But we're moving in that direction where you can have pilots operate far from the front lines. and you don't have to be, right there with all of them. So for FPVs, typically it's because when you deploy a team, they're relatively close to the front line. So you have to have someone deploying the UAV, someone near the front line. One guy will be an engineer, so he's in charge of all the munitions. You often, depending on what the target is, you want to have a different munition. You have to make sure you know how to use the initiator properly. A lot of people have lost hands or been killed by improperly putting together FPVs. And remember, a lot of the munitions are homemade. They're not factory-made things, so it's a difficult system. So one guy's an engineer, pilot, co-pilot. Those jobs are interchangeable, but the pilot will always find the co-pilot is trying to help with navigation. You'll often have a fourth member who is maybe flying a UAV, like a Mavic, and the Mavic will be, on the target, locating a target, trying to talk the FPV to the target. So you might be 4 guys, it could be more. You might have one guy just managing antennas. You might have one guy for driver. Keep in mind, to get to their position, you often walk the last 2 or 3 kilometers to get there, right, without a vehicle. So you have to have someone that you have enough people to carry the equipment all the way to that position. So it's a lot of like logistics, issues that you don't consider that are more significant than people think. And then with UGVs, maintaining the communications is very difficult. You have to have a UAV often as a repeater. They're repeating the signal to the UGV. You often need the UAV also as what the pilots don't look through, because actually looking from the UGV camera itself on the ground, you don't really see very much. So you need all these things. You need a maintenance guy. You need all these other kind of additional responsibilities. And so when it comes down to it, right, Ukrainians looking at UAV, they view UAV battalions in all their brigades. They're forming UGV companies. They might become battalions too, probably be companies. But we're talking about hundreds of people. And so, they are the task organization and the table of organization for these units is changing. And it's going to have to change for our military too.
I just wanted to add on this question of swarms particularly, and just to take a step back. I mean, swarms, we often talk about swarms or hear about them, and people think that just means lots of UAVs at once. And that's not really what it means. A swarm in a technical sense is when each UAV is somehow communicating with the other. There's a degree of coordination within the swarm. What I hadn't appreciated is you can see the technical case for that, right? To be able to overwhelm an adversary, but also to minimize the amount of pilot involvement. If a single pilot's able to select a target and launch hundreds of UAVs that can then autonomously approach a target, we basically kind of have missiles that can do that, right? If you look at the Brimstone missile, which the UK has, I think, does Ukraine operate the Brimstone? I think it had. We gave them some, right? I think they fire them off trucks, which I'm not sure the UK is capable of doing actually. And those Brimstone missiles, they're not particularly new, right? They're sort of, I don't know, I guess designed 2 decades ago or something like that. They can each observe what the other one is doing, and so if one missile picks one tank, the other missile in the swarm can pick another tank, so that you're not wasting missiles on the same target. There's no overkill. That's the fundamental appeal, along with saving pilot capacity. The problem, though, is if there is some intra-swarm communication, you have to ask, physics is a thing. So how is that message being sent from one airframe to the other in flight? And typically there will be some kind of radio signal being sent. It may not be subject to the same types of jamming that the control signal is, because it will have a different frequency and a different strength to the one that's being used for the overall control signal, because don't forget you're sending these signals within these drones, which may be very close to one another, but you still have to send them. And at a certain point, when you get to lots of UAVs in flight, it's just clearly a problem from everything I've heard and from everyone I've spoken to, that there is interference between these signals, and that you begin to struggle to send these signals in a reliable way between the drones. So if one of them is approaching a tank from one side and the other one is approaching from the other side, the level of latency, the level of reliability on that communication, it is limited. And ultimately, this is a problem I see across so many areas of uncrewed systems, that what you can do in theory is very different to what you end up being able to do in practice. For example, with underwater systems, you can't rely on radio signals in the same way. And so again and again and again, the very simple issue of how do you get messages to and from the drone is at the heart of the operational limitation on how it can actually be used in practice.
Weather plays a really big role. And it plays a bigger role in UAVs, UGVs than it does for artillery. But it is a consistent problem. It is a problem for Starlink as well. Starlink is used in a lot of these UAVs. So as Shashank saying, there's so many basic problems that come up that's much more difficult than people imagine. And it's not nearly as kind of easy and like user friendly as I think people think it might be.
Yeah. So when it comes to autonomy on the battlefield, you can kind of think of it as the new iron triangle between capabilities, which I would say are both effectors and sensors, and compute, cost, and then survivability. Cost, I would also include industrial scaling under there, not just the cost of the single system or sensor. And then in terms of survivability, not just the survivability of the system from, say, 50 cows or whatever, but also from dust, how long does it take to maintain, et cetera. And I think that, trying to get that right in a swarm is really hard because you can have really effective, jam-resistant means of communication, but that also means the swarm costs a lot more money than you necessarily want at a tactical level. So trying to get to that like perfect equation is probably what's going to end up, when you actually see a swarm on the battlefield, it will be because someone solved it.
Or solved it for like a point in time until it gets
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think the sort of takeaway from this, we started with, okay, we have 80% of casualties caused by drones. Like the underlying question of that is like, is this is this an RMA, right? Have we just over the past 3.5 years lived through a revolution in military affairs? And I think the subsequent 30 minutes of our conversation of like, no, look at all of these sort of fundamental limitations and, it's fits and starts and okay, fine. Even if you have an awesome AI to abstract away the pilot level, you still need like a person setting up the thing nearby because the drone can't fly that far without making all these other trade-offs that would make it useful. It's the sort of the contrast between the way I think that the surface level understanding of that fact and the sort of like Rob Lee brigade commander level up view of how these things which are new and are real are actually manifesting in practice, I think is just a fascinating contrast.
And when you've made a system that has very long range, that has the ability to operate in all weather, that has the ability to be jam resistant, to communicate with other UAVs or other aircraft in the same swarm, that has a large payload to cope with the uparming of defenses. Congratulations, you've invented what is a cruise missile. And you can certainly maybe do it cheaper than existing cruise missiles, but you have just invented a very decent cruise missile at that stage.
So on the note of pivoting to UGVs, right? I saw this video over the weekend. I think one of the Ukrainian media services posted basically a soldier getting escorted by UGV. I've heard reports of this for a while, and obviously the U.S. does not have that. I think as a former infantryman, it makes me a little uncomfortable, the idea of basically an unescorted wounded soldier, it possibly need treatment, but, operational necessity. How common are the UGV evacs, and is that really the best place for UGVs right now in the battlefields? And how does that compare to other implementations?
Sorry, UGV. This is like a ground robot that can walk like a dog or a little truck or a little.
Typically trundle along on treads more often than ambulate.
Yeah. So UGVs have been a big focus this year for Ukraine, in large part because infantry is a big deficit. They don't have enough people, and they one of the ways to try and reduce infantry casualties is have UGVs replace some of these missions. So the vast majority of missions done by UGVs are logistics. I mean, probably my understanding is that they were procuring 70% of the UGVs are procuring this year, like were for logistics or more. I think the actual missions is higher. And for the, there's some units here that have invested very early on. So 3rd Assault Brigade is the kind of famous brigade. They made this a big focus, and they're kind of much further along than a lot of other units are. Hartia, other brigades, also made this a big focus, but it's becoming more common across the board. So logistics is the main thing, and keep in mind all these UGVs can carry 300 pounds of equipment, and so they can bring in ammunition, food, water. You can bring really heavy things, right? So if you need to bring a 50 cal machine gun to the front line, UGV can do this, right? Something UAV cannot bring it there. Logistics also moved by night bomber UAVs, like Vampires is also quite common. It was kind of more common before. And it's still a combination. And actually, And Ukraine brigades, the engineer sections will often have both UGVs and night bomber UAVs to do this kind of logistics function as well, in addition to kind of supporting battalions. So I mean, again, I would say it's probably 90% of missions are logistics. They have used remote weapon systems on this sometimes. They do test those. My understanding is quite difficult to use them. So obviously the camera is not great. It can obviously shake. You really probably want a UAV there too to kind of observe where the impact is hitting. And even if everything works out, right, if you lose signal, and you often lose a signal to the UGV, then it won't operate for a certain amount of time. UGVs are vulnerable to like anything else. It's not as big of a truck, but it's also not a tiny target. And the Russians go after them all the time with FPVs. And again, the Russians, like both sides, they focus on the roads, they focus on the logistics routes. Anything they see along that route, right, they'll try and hit, whether it's infantry, UGV, or truck. So UGVs get hit quite often. As you said, casualty evacuation is becoming more common. I'm not sure that the quite scale. I asked more about this back in February and March, but some brigades will do it only in extremis, where basically we have no way of getting someone out, and this is the only option we have. We can't bring a vehicle up there. We can't walk this guy out. So UGV is the only option. The problem though is that because you often lose the signal to UGVs, and keep in mind, right? So UAVs, UGVs, in both cases, it's mostly line of sight. And so the antenna for UAVs is a bit easier to operate because the UAV is up in the sky. Antenna from the ground is repeating the signal. It becomes a problem when it comes to the ground, like an FPV, and you lose connection at the ends because of the curvature of the earth and other issues. Well, UGVs are on the ground. So it's always more of a problem with line of sight, which is why you really need almost always some kind of UAV repeating the signal to the UGV. Some UGVs do Starlink. Starlink's quite good, but Starlink will not work if it's under trees or forests. And so you have to have kind of redundancy on comms. All of this, of course, costs money. It makes the UGV kind of more expensive. But the risk for CASEVAC is if you lose signal to UGV, which is not that uncommon, you're stranding a wounded guy out there on his own. There is no one there with him. And, I've seen videos of Russian FPVs hitting these UGVs with CASEVAC. I've seen them dropping grenades at guys who are being casualty evacuated. And it's just simply not something you want to have happen. So I think it does happen. They do, some units are using them. I think in many cases, it's really when there's no other option. Maybe it's a wound they just can't take care of at the front line. I've heard of cases, I remember all this. I think I've heard of cases of guys who had lost legs and were still at the front line for days or weeks at a time before they get evacuated. They survived. But it's really is that difficult in some cases because these positions it's so difficult to get to. So it is becoming more common. But as I said about UAVs, you really have to think through with UGVs the route plan much more because obviously the ground matters a lot. It depends on what is the concealment. You obviously want to have concealment from Russian UAVs. At the same time, if you're concealed from Russian UAVs, it means the signal is probably going to be a problem for you. Some of the units are deploying kind of ground-based signals that can repeat the signal along the way. And that's if you've got a very dedicated area, but that also costs a lot of money. And it's probably going to cost, you require kind of really elite type of systems like Silvus or so on to kind of do that kind of system. And so it comes back really to, what is your signal source and how useful is it? How effective is it? And, whether as a problem too. So all sorts of issues. They're being used kind of out of necessity because they don't have enough infantry. It's too dangerous to drive their front line. But again, UGV is also it's a range issue. So you might have enough battery, but how good is the signal to get you that far in the front line? You can't move as far as with UAVs. So lots of considerations there too. There obviously is a desire to create some kind of terrain mapping system where UGV can kind of work autonomously. I don't think we're there yet. Maybe there's something being developed in Western countries, but it is really a significant need. And but again, most logistics, some casualty evacuation, small amount of remote weapon systems. Mining, demining is also a good option. And they do use kamikaze UGVs, usually small ones. But I've seen cases where they put an entire 500-pound aviation bomb on one of these things, just drive it up to a bridge and blow it up. So they do that too.
There's a lot of use of this also, just to broaden the conversation out beyond Ukraine. We've seen the IDF do a lot of this in Gaza in the last few years as well. Obviously, it's a bit of an easier task for them. It's a much, much smaller piece of ground. I know Gaza itself would represent a minuscule patch of the Ukrainian front line. So, visibility, communications is much easier. But we've seen them used for all kinds of things: patrolling, sentry duties, bomb clearance, which of course is a very long-standing UGV task, but also effectively laying down explosives to breach targets, all of those kinds of things. So, I think Ukraine's kind of not the only testing ground where we're seeing some of this.
How many of these lessons are our European allies taking? The American military, from my perspective, wants to take some of these lessons, but only the ones that are convenient. And then two, how much does that translate to actual budget and policy and not just, lessons learned in the schoolhouse?
In my time in this job covering defense, I think there's been sort of two fundamental questions. One of them is the one that Jordan alluded to, which is, are we living through a revolution in military affairs, or are we seeing just incremental changes, many of them kind of tactical significance, but not accumulating to a larger transformation in terms of war? And the other one is, which is very closely linked to that, is which of the Ukraine lessons are relevant to other people and which ones are confined to Ukraine or indeed to a particular time and space inside Ukraine. And I think those debates are completely unsettled right now because partly because we don't know what context we'd be fighting in, but also because, this is a genuinely difficult debate to have. The answers are genuinely unclear. And so the first answer is, which lessons do we mean? Because people will take different lessons to suit themselves. And you see that in Europe as well. But by and large, at the kind of tactical level, I see, when I look at the British, I think the British are quite in an interesting position because they are in a fairly unique position with regard to Ukraine, right? They have been, like the US, over the shoulder of Ukraine at the kind of theater level and the strategic level in, SAG-U, in Europe, in European headquarters, which have been training and helping Ukrainians at the level of chief of defense, very, very close relationship. But they have also been tactically involved with Ukraine, inside Ukraine, at a level that the US has not been to the same extent because of the limitations imposed by the Biden administration on the presence of overt US forces inside Ukraine. So just to cut a long story short, when I have looked at UK British Army training, doctrine, thinking about this, I have seen a real effort to absorb some of these lessons around Ukraine, around how do you organize, how do you structure your squads and your companies and your units, how do you build kill webs that are more effective in an area, in an environment of constant surveillance. And I see lots of those lessons being absorbed. But fundamentally, and here is where I just want to pull up as I'm speaking, a speech that Tony Radakin gave, weirdly, of all places, to the I think the National Defense University in China. I think it's in Beijing, if I'm not mistaken.
Cool.
He was allowed to go. He was allowed to go in April, and he gave a speech, and it was recently published because someone put a Freedom of Information request in, and it was a theme he was very fond of, which basically said, "We would not fight like Ukraine." I'm literally quoting. He says, "We would not fight like Ukraine. The British way of warfare is rooted in an expeditionary and maneuverist mindset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera," right? And we can go on about that. But the point is, you saw the same thing in his speech he gave in December, which is, we would fight more like Israel. That's his pitch, right? He talked about the Israeli attack on Iranian missiles, Iranian sites using long-range air-launched ballistic missiles, and said, that's the way we would like to do this. We don't want to
That's
have
the way
a
everyone would
positional-
like to do this.
Well,
I mean,
that's the criticism,
Yeah.
right? That's the criticism, which is, you may not like positional war, but positional war is interested in you. And so that's
Yeah.
the pushback. But on the point about how much of this is reflected in new budgets, I would say that if you look at the British Defence Review published in the summer, which is one example among many I could pick in Europe, it says that I think something like 10% of new spending should go on innovative projects. Now, when I spoke to one of the people involved in that review a few weeks ago, they said, I wish I had been more specific what I meant by that, because you have people popping up and arguing F-35 is an innovative capability. You have people popping up and saying attack submarines are innovative capabilities, which of course, at one level is true, but absolutely not what the people who wrote that defense review meant. So the long and short of it is, I think that we're still in a period of intellectual debate over the meaning of these lessons. We haven't got a settled view that lets that translate reliably into different ways, completely different ways of fighting, or completely different equipment and spending patterns.
well, I mean, saying we're still in an intellectual debate, I think, is a generous way of interpreting it, because you can have intellectual debate, But you can also have like being serious about the intellectual debate and being not serious about the intellectual debate. And I think, this is a theme that came up with our Chris Bros Androl interview. Maybe the question is like, what would your barometer be, Shashank, for people just taking the fact that we have this weird artifact to study and process and respond to with the degree of sort of, I don't know, first principles thinking or solemnity that is required when you have a war like this?
I wonder if I've been a little bit harsh in answering then, because if you look at NATO and some of the stuff that it's doing, you do see lessons being absorbed, right? So NATO, for example, has contracted with Palantir to build the Maven Smart system, which is a digital targeting web that is able to kind of fuse intelligence from different sources. It's a command and control system that lets you get one step closer to that vision of any sensor, any shooter, that sort of stuff that Jordan, you and I have talked about on this show before. If you look at what the what the head of Allied Land Command, General Chris Donahue, is doing, they've got this idea called the Eastern Flank Deterrence Line, where they are investing in low-cost interceptors, low-cost firepower, and trying to stitch it together into a system that you could say plausibly is more Ukraine-like. But I think what's holding them back is this concern that if I buy up a production line of 1 million UAVs today, the revolution is going to pass me by, that these things will become obsolete in 18 months' time. And actually what I need to invest in is not the airframes, not the UAVs, not the actual effectors, so to speak, if you forgive the jargon, but the kind of command and control systems that let me see the battlefield and use those in an effective way. And on that, I'll just say, I don't think the picture is necessarily as bleak as I may have inadvertently suggested. But for me, what would be the test is if we have exercises and simulations and modeling happening inside these armed forces that are testing for a wide range of scenarios and asking, are we able to survive and prosper in these scenarios? So if Ukrainians were to come and visit your exercises, they would be able to recognize elements of this and say, that is serious. That is not just for show.
Yeah, and I would, the split screen in my head is the takeaway that we need to have less DEI and be more warrior culture and lethal and like start a war with Venezuela. But anyways, so Rob, thoughts on all of this?
I talk to some people in the military, some of our friends or others in the Marine Corps elsewhere. I think there is an effort to try and pull back lessons. I think one thing that I've noticed is that younger service members are more likely to be on social media. They're more likely to see what's going on in Ukraine on Twitter, Telegram, whatever. Older people are less likely to be on social media and less likely to see some of these things. And so there might be a gap sometimes with senior generals who may not be seeing things that are open source and be missing out on things that younger people will see, like the role of FPVs and so on. So I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. I mean, I think there are lessons being learned. It's very clear like European countries are making this very, very important kind of focus. Clearly, the UK is making this. Denmark, I hear a lot about Denmark kind of really trying to bring out lessons here too. And obviously the Baltic countries, they know that this is very relevant to them. I think there's, Shashank said that there is a question about what things applied to us will apply to, to a different war we would fight in. My background is the U.S. Marine, and the U.S. Marine Corps is focused on China and Asia Pacific. To what extent is China going to fight the same way in the terrain and so on? I think there are legitimate questions about that, but I would say for European defense, if Russia is the main threat to European countries, well, Ukraine is fighting Russia right now, and they demonstrate, on a daily basis, here's what's effective against the Russian military, here's what's not effective against the Russian military, and they're adapting for a reason. And of course, war is the best, there's a sense of urgency in Ukraine that you don't have anywhere else. And it's the best kind of place to adapt and learn from his lessons. So I think there's a lot of things that we should be learning from Ukraine. I think FPVs, it's not a fad. It is something here to stay. I think a lot of the other kind of low cost, adaptations Ukraine has employed, like using helicopters to counter Shaheds. I think it was like 6 helicopter crews shot down something like 3,000 Shahed or similar UAVs the first 6 months of this year, right? Significant, success rate, low cost, very small number of helicopters. Those are things that we should be, practicing too. And maybe it doesn't make sense to us. Maybe there's a better option we have, but at least we should go through the motions of seeing, here's what they're doing. There's a reason Ukraine's doing this. It's not just because, they're doing it for no reason. They think it's a good way of countering this. For UAV interceptors, is obviously a big priority here right now. Counter-nation heads. Some companies are doing well. Obviously, Eric Schmidt's company was doing quite well. They still are, I think. There are a bunch of other, low-cost options, Ukrainian-made options too, that are also counter-nation heads. So in terms of, bringing back lessons, there's a lot to learn from here. I think for Europe, it's even more appropriate because Russia is the main threat for European countries, and it makes sense to use what Ukraine is using because they're fighting here. I think for the U.S., there's some different questions because the U.S. is more focused on other areas. Maybe Venezuela today. Maybe it's who knows. And it's not clear that always lessons will apply exactly as evenly. But also keep in mind, like the Russians keep adapting. They keep innovating. They are scaling up their own UAV force right now. So they have their own unmanned systems force that's being created. They have some elite units at the Rubicon Center, which is a quite effective organization. They're scaling the size of that. Rubicon is responsible for all unmanned systems development. So is UAVs, is UGVs, is naval drones. They now have some at least 8 or 9 combat detachments that are fighting Ukraine. They're constantly kind of spreading lessons quite quickly, TTPs, other kind of innovations. They bring back all the analytics, all the research and development. And so, they are innovating, and they've made this unit a real priority for funding, for selecting good personnel. And what we see in the Russian military in a few years, it could also look quite different than we're seeing, in 2022, 2023. It's like, it is important for us to keep in mind, the innovation cycle in Ukraine is very quick, and it means both sides are learning. And anytime Ukraine comes with adaptation, Russia will copy it, will learn from it too. And they'll probably learn from it faster than we will because, it's more painful for them, right? So Operation Spiderweb, I guarantee you Russia's learned more from that operation than we did because it was a very embarrassing thing for them. And they probably know how to, they probably are thinking about how they could do that own operation themselves against, European countries. So anyway, in some ways, we are at the whim of any kind of new Ukrainian innovation becomes a threat to us eventually because Russia will learn from it, and they could try to apply it to NATO countries too. And the Ukrainians are very innovative, and so that is somewhat of a concern. But there's a tremendous thing to learn. But again, I don't have the great insight on all these countries, but I do think many countries are making this a real priority. So I'm not as pessimistic as maybe some people are in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the sort of what Operation Spiderweb means for the future, I mean, we had all these drones fly over all these airports in Europe, which is crazy. And I remember you, Rob, I think it was a podcast with Mike Hoffman, where as soon as it happened, you're just like, oh yeah, everyone should just be aware that this can happen everywhere in the world. And it has been kind of shocking to me that, there's not a big push, at least as I've seen in America, to have things that can shoot down drones around airports or anywhere else for that matter. I mean, Shashank, is it surprising to you that kind of play by Putin hasn't led to more thinking, or what do you think the response has been so far?
Well, first of all, there's a real attribution problem. There's a genuine attribution problem. There's an intelligence gap, right? If you talk frankly to people, they suspect this is Russian activity, but they equally are aware that when you looked at some of the drone sightings on the East Coast last year in the United States, they will tell you they think there was an element of mass hysteria involved as well. And so distinguishing the real from the fake is difficult. Sure. 2 weeks ago, I was interviewing Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, and I pressed him on it and said, look, why can't you just tell us if you think these were Russian or not? And it became very quickly apparent that they don't know, right? They say the investigation is ongoing, we're looking into it. And either the intelligence is of such high grade that they cannot reveal anything about attribution, in which case it's useless because, what do you do with that then if it's that unreleasable, or there's a genuine intelligence gap. The other one is if you suspect these are Russian, even if you think that, these are a problem, you have to be very careful shooting them down, right? Because if you're a politician, and we've just had this debate here, in this country, the British Defense Secretary today, as we're talking, is loosening rules to allow more shoot downs of drones over military bases. If one of these UAVs falls on a village or a vehicle killing somebody or injuring somebody,
Yeah.
that I promise you, that is 10 times the political scandal for the minister in charge than the fact that an hostile state may have been flying UAV surveillance over their military bases. So think about the political incentives at work here as well. And then finally, of course, there is the economy problem of how do you have economic interceptors? How do you shoot enough of these down in a way that is not just burning through useful interceptors that you need in wartime? That's not so much a problem for kind of weird quadcopter sightings over your base. That's a problem for your decoy drones flying into Poland, where I think it is a genuine issue. You can take these things down once, you can take them down twice, but if you're expending your entire stock of air-to-air missiles on these things, you're giving the Russians what they want, and you desperately need an alternative solution. I will say I am seeing those solutions coming through, right? I'm seeing them coming through on low-cost interceptors that are being developed by a number of companies. I'm seeing them come through on, other means of interception, including directed energy. So that is happening. But my point is, it isn't just a technical problem. It's also a kind of political incentives problem.
Sure. Rob, you brought up China. This is China talk. Does China come up when you're talking to these folks on the front? Is it like a relevant variable people are annoyed at or confused about?
It is. Look, the UAVs, either components of UAVs are largely coming from China, right? So I think the Mavic is the most important UAV in this war. The Mavic 3, Mavic 3T, now the Mavic 4 is a new line of them. There's also Autel, which is also a Chinese company, the other kind of common quadcopter type UAV. These are used for reconnaissance, they're used for dropping grenades, and they're cheap. They're like a few $1,000s. The Mavic 3T has a thermal camera, and so it is the main kind of reconnaissance system for nighttime. It has a good thermal camera. It sees things quite effectively. And so the Mavics are very important. One thing important for Ukraine is you have to kind of update the firmware. You have to kind of hack into it, because normally the Mavic, when you use the system DJI, I forget the name of the system, the computer system, but it shows the location of the operator and the UAV. And so you obviously want to remove that before you actually start operating the UAV in the front line. And so you have to kind of jailbreak it. And what the Ukrainians say is that the Russians have their Mavics pre-jailbroken by China, whereas Ukraine has to kind of jailbreak it themselves every time. And so there's a real benefit where Russia gets more Mavics. The ratio, I asked Vadim Suvorsky, the former commander of Assistance Forces back in, I think, March, about the ratio of Mavics. He says like 6-1 Russian advantage. He thought it was quite significant. And Mavics are important. I talked to a Ukrainian brigade commander in the Novopavlovka area, and he said the biggest problem is adjacent brigades. The adjacent brigades did not have enough Mavics, and that was the biggest issue. Like, I asked about ammunition, he's like, that's the biggest problem they have. So this is quite important. Having that kind of supply is important. Also, China, a lot of fiber optic cables coming from China. Apparently, they've really significantly increased this year, and those are important for a lot of FPVs because you can use fiber optic cable on FPVs. It makes them so you can't jam them. That's a kind of important benefit. There are a number of new UAVs that Russia's operating. So obviously there's the Harpia, which is kind of like their knockoff of the Shahed, which I think has a lot of Chinese components. There are also a couple of new ones like the VTU. There's I forget the name. There's a couple other ones that are kind of new modern type of kamikaze drones, and it's mostly or largely Chinese components. And so again, it is quite significant. I think that is a significant benefit that Russia gets. Obviously China is not providing, I think, like ammunition or real military equipment, but having all that supply chain available, I think, is a really significant advantage. And Ukrainian commanders do mention we are at a disadvantage because Russia can get these things from China easily. Ukraine also gets things from China. Engines for UAVs are from China. A lot of components are still from China. And so they still are going through it as well, but it's often more difficult thing for them to procure those systems. So it does come up. It is a significant thing they believe. But look, fortunately, China has not provided military equipment the same way they haven't provided kind of ammunition, other things. It's mostly components, mostly kind of helping the UAV front. But because UAVs are playing such a dominant role in the war, it is a significant advantage that Russia has.
Maybe this is a Shashank question. Wang Yi, I think, said to some European diplomats that, look, if we were actually supporting Russia, this war would have been over years ago. I don't know, thoughts or reflections on that comment?
Well, raw industrial capacity alone the recipe for victory. So he's a little bit cocky there. But there is a point under that, which is that I certainly spend a lot of time thinking, what is China giving Russia? How close has it walked up to the line of armed support? And I think that on certain systems, it has walked up to the line and stepped across it, particularly when it comes to kind of armed UAV designs. Even if it isn't transferring the payload, it's transferring UAVs that are basically designed to be armed. Do I think that's happening on a decisive war-winning, decisive scale that is relevant compared to the stuff Russia is making itself? No. I think it's quite a niche capability still. But to your point, Jordan, there was a moment in this conflict where I think Russia could have been in a far more difficult position, right? So had the Ukrainians been able to press their advantage in late 2022, had the offensives of 2023 gone very differently, and they went the way they did for lots of reasons that we're all kind of familiar with at this stage. At that stage, had the Russians been in a much, much more difficult position, my belief is that there was a much greater likelihood the Chinese would have stepped in, and they could have absolutely filled lots of Russia's need for basic artillery and other systems. They have the stockpiles, they have the capacity to do it, and I think the reason they didn't do it was, the threshold for doing it was very high because it would involve blowing up their relationship with Europe, which to this day the Chinese don't wish to do. Although sometimes sometimes they give the opposite impression, but they don't want to blow it up. And if they are going to do it, it would have to be because it is necessary, and it wasn't necessary. It didn't prove necessary. But we know that the Russians gave wish lists to the Chinese in 2022 in an early part of this conflict, and the Chinese, by and large, did not provide the bulk of what the Russians wanted, even covertly. I don't think there's much evidence on the table that there was, significant provision. There is, I think, an interesting question to be asked about air defense in certain areas, but there's very little to go on that, I'd suggest. So had the Chinese poured that support into Russia, it would have accentuated Russia's advantage. But the point is, China didn't do it to accentuate Russia's advantage. They would only have done it to redress a major problem for Russia, if that makes sense. And now, if you look at where the conflict is headed, it's a complex judgment to make. Nobody can speak with any certainty. You have big underlying problems of the corrosion of Ukraine's force. You have significant long-term economic troubles on the Russian side, and the questions of whether the gains they're making are proportionate to the losses they're suffering. But by and large, no one would say to the Chinese that if you don't step in and help, the Russians are toast. And as long as that's the case, I think China has other geopolitical equities it is protecting, and it will continue to protect. And the more uncertain U.S.-China ties get, Jordan, which you know much better than I do, the more I think the Chinese will seek to preserve some latitude in their relationship with Europe. And that will always hold them back from going all out on provision of that aid.
We got to do a little detour to the UK-China spy scandal. Oh my God, Shashank!
Yeah, crazy story.
Mess.
Yeah, total mess. And Jordan, I don't know how much you need me to unpack it, but I can't give you the answer to the fundamental question, which is why has this case collapsed? Because my gut feeling initially, if I'd had this conversation with you 2 weeks ago, would be that this case collapsed because the prosecutors, the Crown Prosecution Service, which is somewhat independent from the leadership, unlike in your country, by the way, I'm sorry to say, wanted the government witnesses to say China is a national security threat, because that is what is required by the Official Secrets Act, which is this arcane piece of 1911 legislation under which these two people were charged. And here I say, for the purposes of my lawyers, they deny the charges. And if the government didn't give enough sort of robust assertion that China's a national security threat, even if we don't call it an enemy, it is a national security threat, I can see why the prosecutors may have said we can't push this case forward. But having seen all the evidence that the government provided to the prosecutors, the witness statements by Matthew Collins, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor, having read those 3 statements, they lay out the full spectrum of Chinese espionage, and they also talk about China's authoritarian status and the challenge that poses, and they talk about Chinese influence operations and China's willingness to co-opt people at early stages in their careers for the purposes of influencing policy, not just for stealing secrets. You take all that together, I do not know what the prosecutors wanted that was more than they received. They say they were 5% short of what they needed for a potential conviction. I do not know what more they wanted to see. I don't know if you've read the statement, if you've been able to establish this.
Yeah. It's wild. It's ridiculous. I mean, look, again, not a UK legal expert, but I think it has to be some, political level, like we're just going to pull this, because I don't know why else.
No. I think that's a mistake. Don't underestimate the degree to which the Crown Prosecution Service is truly independent of government. And this Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is I don't know how many of your listeners will know this. He is a former Director of Public Prosecutions. He is a former head of the prosecution service. He's by the book on these things. By the book. He would not be messing around behind the scenes to say politically, I want this quashed. That stuff just. I'm not saying that there could have been a decision to hold back on the evidence provided in order not to have to say in court we are petrified of China and China's a massive national security threat. But it would not have been to try and politically just quash the case and make it go away. That's not how they work. And so when I look at those witness statements, if the aim was to soft pedal China and to go easy on China to avoid a public diplomacy row, these witness statements were not the ones you would have provided if that's what your aim was. So I think fundamentally the problem here is the prosecution being risk averse and or incompetent. One of those two. But of course, all of this is happening at the same time as we are seeing, the government grappling with its position on China more broadly, and the big decision of whether to approve the new Chinese embassy in East London, which, by the way, one of my colleagues informed me is the site of the Royal Mint, which not many people seem to have picked up on this, other than my colleague who found it in our archives, is on the same site of the Royal Mint where the silver from the ransom and the opium wars was taken in the 1840s, which just weirdly, by the way, hasn't been noticed in the British press. But I find it completely amazing that this is where the Chinese have chosen to build their gigantic new Bond villain style mega embassy. But that decision has now been delayed again. So we're back in this kind of period of limbo with the Chinese making these very Chinese ominous sounding noises about grave consequences should the decision not be approved. And the hot potato's been thrown down the road again, to mix metaphors.
Oh my God. Well, we'll check in with you in a month or two maybe on this. Let's maybe conclude a bit on strategic level stuff. I mean, so look, I think it's fair to price in just a Trump that's going to be hot and cold on all of this and just wants a solution and is kind of agnostic as to like what it would matter for anything, 3 months down the road, much less like 1 or 2 years. But maybe to start with Rob, to what extent does this, do the summits and the drama that plays out in Financial Times articles like end up rippling down to the people who you're interacting with on the front?
No, I mean, look, I think there is an element where the Ukrainians who are fighting, they want the U.S. to kind of be supported. They want to be part of this. I think there is, for some, there is an idealistic aspect where the U.S. is kind of the leading democratic country with, this supporter of freedom worldwide, and that Ukraine sees itself in fighting this kind of fight against, authoritarianism, against oligarchy, against all these kind of issues, which are trying to kind of leave. And they're fighting for, democracy and freedom. I think there are Ukrainians who absolutely believe this. And I think it is tough for them to see the U.S. not live up to, what the ideals they believe, that they think the U.S. kind of represents. I think, for most, they kind of look at them, they're frustrated, but at the same time, the day-to-day is the same thing. Where they get up every morning, the Russians are not stopping. Yes, the U.S. could increase, its deliveries of weapon systems and new capabilities. But even in those cases, it doesn't mean the war's going to end. It doesn't mean the threat from Russia is going to end. And I think that most Ukrainians are quite realistic about this. They know that Russia is a long-term threat to them. And that even if there's a ceasefire, it doesn't mean the threat's over. And there are a lot of potentially negative scenarios that happen even with a ceasefire, even with a peace deal, because there are lots of long-term, issues that Ukraine faces. So, Ukrainians watch this. I mean, when the Oval Office thing happened in February, I just met a unit in the front line. And I spent that night, I was sleeping in like a mortar battery commander's apartment in Dordoya. And so we actually watched the video together. It was no one was very happy about it. Right? It was a very awkward moment. And it's always awkward for me being there and thinking like, what are these guys thinking of me as an American? Like, do they trust me or does that change? But again, I think all of us kind of said, well, that was bad. Hopefully, things get improved better in the future. I was at the front line last time with the last Oval Office meeting in July, where it was the opposite, right? Where I was like, oh, like, the vibes are much more positive. I'm like, okay, this is much better. But, it ultimately, the rhetoric has changed a lot in the Trump administration. Donald Trump changes rhetoric all the time. Sometimes very, favorable to Ukraine, sometimes very negative to Ukraine. But really, it's looking at what is the U.S. actually doing. And so when Trump came in, he continued providing the aid that the Biden administration had signed. Except for that 1 week, right? He continued providing intelligence sharing. It seems like intelligence sharing is as strong, if not stronger, than it was back during the Biden administration. So that's continuing. If the U.S. is providing intelligence about deep strikes into Russian refineries, that is, that's notable. That's not nothing. But what part of the question is, and the big change here was when the Trump administration decided they created this PURL system to allow European countries to buy munitions for Ukraine from the United States. That still seems to be a policy. And so Tomahawks didn't happen. That's not that surprising. There are other things that are arriving. The ERAMs, these air-launched missiles should be arriving in the next few months. Those could be quite useful for Ukraine. I think those were always signed before Trump came in office. I could be wrong about that. So, again, a lot of this is going to come back to the rhetoric goes up and down, but ultimately, if the U.S. is still providing critical weapons, right, Patriot interceptors, GMLRS, things that Europeans cannot make themselves, right, and Europe can buy these things, okay, it's not the ideal situation, it's not the ideal situation I'd want, but at least it's not the kind of worst case scenario. The U.S. is providing what it very much needs to for Ukraine, and Europe can still kind of compensate in a lot of ways. So, again, I think Ukrainians are realistic about this. I think some probably have a lower opinion of America than they used to. But I think many others still see the U.S. in a very positive light, and they see that, politicians and politics go up and down in all countries, and see you can't always judge, countries by whatever the rhetoric is for the leader from this day or another day. So, again, a lot of my question after last week is the Trump administration going to try to coerce Ukraine into accepting kind of Russia's proposal? And in that case, right, if the Trump administration said we're not going to provide Patriot interceptors or GMLRS or we're going to cut off intel sharing, right, that would be significant. But if the U.S. continues to provide those things and just says, well, we want you to make a deal, but we're not going to force you to do so, then the policy hasn't really changed that much since the beginning of the Trump administration, I'd say.
I agree wholeheartedly with Rob, which is that there's two fundamental points that come out of that, right? One is Trump has not endorsed the Russian demand for land swaps to say, we'll cede some of our claims in Kherson and Zaporizhia, but you give us the unoccupied parts of Donbass, which was the kind of swirling demands around pre-Alaska. That hasn't happened. He's still come down on the side of a freeze. And this is a big topic to open up at the end, but my belief is that a freeze can benefit Ukraine if it's followed up properly, which I might not have been my view had we had this conversation 18 months ago or something like that. And the second absolutely critical fact is that Trump is still selling weapons to Europeans to give to Ukraine. And by the way, I put this I mentioned my interview with Rutte earlier, Mark Rutte, and I said to him, well, he's selling these on commercial terms. That's clearly not as good as Joe Biden's policy. And Rutte said, no, it's not on commercial terms. It's a cost price. The Pearl scheme, I think it's PURL, is it? It's a cost price. And so, on what you might call relatively acceptable or favorable terms. As long as that continues, we're no worse off, although, it depends if you believe that Tomahawks or other long-range systems were ever really on the table in a serious way. So I agree with Rob completely. As long as that's the case, nothing has fundamentally changed in the U.S. position. The underlying dynamics of the conflict are still there. My only thing I'd add is that I think as Europeans, as we take on more of the burden for that spending to send those weapons to Ukraine, we will have to think in a more mature and sensible way about what a European-led peace process might look like in 12 months' time if the war continues to deliver minimal gains to the Russians at very high cost, The Ukrainians look like their position is stable. They survive a winter campaign against the energy grid, which is going to be absolutely brutal. If they look in a relatively stable position in 8-9 months' time, and the Russians are beginning to think, well, actually, these offensives are not delivering us enough, and we have to then think about general mobilization again, Europe has to have a vision of what a peace process looks like. Trump, for all his faults, has initiated a process. He's done it in a pretty cack-handed and mercurial and ludicrous fashion, but he has actually initiated that process. Europeans will have to think about that at some stage, and I'm not sure that the mentality is quite ready in Europe for that yet.
A lot of focus on Tomahawks this last meeting, and I didn't actually think Tomahawks were necessarily that significant. I thought it would have been significant as a signal that Trump was willing to do something that Biden had not done that was kind of potentially more escalatory, seen as escalatory. The numbers of Tomahawks we would have provided probably would have been pretty small. So like the actual effects, if it's low quantities, would not necessarily been massive on the front line. But it's still a question if Trump could still provide other things to his payroll system. He could potentially provide TACMs. He could provide other things. And if his mentality is, we're not going to provide for free, but if you buy it from us, we'll provide basically whatever Ukraine wants, right? Or maybe these kind of things. Some of these things could be quite useful. And I do think the ERAMs, if it works out as people think it will, I think this will be pretty important because the numbers are quite large. It's a pretty cheap missile. And I think it could complicate Russia's kind of situation. And so, again, it's dealing with the rhetoric versus with the actual what's happening. I think we focus too much on Trump's rhetoric every day, and we know that his rhetoric changes, quite often. It's always ups and downs. But you come back to me and look at, okay, what is the actual U.S. actually doing? And a lot of support is still important. And so hopefully still, sustains itself. As Shashank was saying, I think the concern going into 2026 is the war is becoming more costly for both sides. And the risks are growing for both sides because, both the economies are becoming more difficult. Both sides are improving their deep strike capabilities. And so they're getting through more often. They're hitting critical infrastructure. And the casualties are very high too. And ultimately, the problem is that Russia's taking a lot of losses and a lot of costs, but Russia has shown they can endure a lot of costs. And it's not clear where that breaking point is, right? Economic breaking point, political breaking point, the casualties. I mean, again, I think most countries would not be willing to kind of put up with what Russia's put up with here. And yet it doesn't look like they're about to break. And I think it's very difficult to kind of point out when might a breaking point happen. And so again, that's still the concern, is that Russia can really bear a lot. And, it's a question, can Ukraine continue to bear the same kind of cost and price, given it's a smaller country and has kind of less advantages in some respects?
I struggle to kind of, to make predictions on this now with any confidence because of the uncertainty of these variables on both sides, right? The variables that Rob is raising, they're quite hidden, they're quite obscure, they're quite finely balanced. And in a way, if the deal on the table was a better deal, if what the Russians were proposing was something you felt could be negotiated, or there was something, there was a secure future here for Ukraine, this will be much tougher to call. In a way, this is simpler because the Russian demands are so draconian that actually it makes it an easier judgment that Ukraine should, right now it's clearly rational for Ukraine to run these risks because it's not guaranteed to come out on top, but it has a perfectly good chance of continuing to frustrate Russian objectives for much longer in a way that will continue to sow doubt in the Russian mind. But I don't know where things will go, and I think we should be very humble and accept that after a very rough winter, Russian reconstitution, if there's a sort of change in politics in Europe, which I don't see on the horizon, but if there is, the balance could tip, and I think that you could see the prognosis looking worse for Ukraine in the spring. I'm very, very uncertain right now, and I'm not confident on sort of calling it in either direction.
And Shashank, the last time we did this show with Mike Horowitz, I think it was literally the day after the Zelensky Trump meeting in the White House. And basically what Rob is saying, his interpretation is like a version of the taco trade, right? Where like nothing happens, like he's not going to cave too far in one direction or the other. But I don't know. I mean, 10 months, like things can get into his head, and the sort of the percentage chance of him either sort of like siding with the Ukrainians and giving them whatever they want, and okay, we're sending the CIA to go in Venezuela, maybe we'll fucking send the CIA to blow up some oil refineries or something if oil is at like $40 a barrel.
Jordan,
Who cares?
On the taco point, I think people have to remember taco cuts both ways, right? It means
totally, yeah.
So he may not he's not going to run major risks on behalf of Ukraine, but actually there's also the other way is he's not going to expend great resources to sort of deliver something for the Russians. If he thinks the Russians are simply sort of dragging their feet on this, he will detach himself. So chickening out cuts in both directions. He'll chicken out from having to truly coerce, to put it in Rob's terms, he will also chicken out from having to truly coerce Ukraine in a really serious way, because there's still just about enough in it for him. And so I'm coming kind of round to the view that you need a Zen-like detachment from the swings of the pendulum, and try and keep your eyes on the sort of longer trajectory of Trump's vision for this, which is, I don't want the U.S. to be very exposed.
Our 80% center of gravity is like the same thing he's doing. We're like, okay, we're still letting the Europeans buy the stuff. We're still giving the intelligence. Maybe we have 10% on the one side of like swing really hard to Ukraine, 10% on the other swing really hard to Putin. But maybe the factor that I can count on most is just like his deep and abiding ADD and his okay, if it's not working, we'll just move on to a different thing. And that isn't necessarily a different strategy in this, even though we've sort of seen the pendulum swing 2 times. But it's like, okay, well, we'll just like send ICE to New York City, and like that'll be my thing for the week. If like, me yelling at Zelensky in the Oval Office doesn't get us anywhere, then something else will like pop up to divert his attention from maybe pulling us too far in one direction or the other. Rob, we end every episode with a song. You mentioned earlier, like everyone's got phones everywhere. Like what's popping in the bunkers? Like what playlists are people downloading on Spotify before they go on airplane mode?
In Ukraine, I'm not sure. I mean, again, you'll hear Western music here too. There's a song called Fortress Bakhmut, which is quite popular, I think a couple years ago during the battle.
Okay.
You still hear it sometimes, but so there's some songs that are made for the military or made about the war, but again,
maybe just like from a genre perspective, like what types of music is like pop, rock? I don't know.
I mean, it's military, so you're probably gonna get guys who like metal. You'll hear a lot of rap too. So in that respect, it's not that dissimilar to like maybe U.S. military. But I don't know. This is not a question I was expecting. So I'm not sure. I'm sure it should vary quite a bit. I mean, and you also have a lot of women fighting too, and they may have different music choices. And there's a joke that a lot of people in the military, even in the tough branches, they all kind of like white girl music instead. So there's always a love for Lady Gaga or Katy Perry. I remember. Before my Afghanistan deployment, Bad Romance came out. So that was like the song of our, Afghanistan deployment. So,
oh my God,
it varies. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe from like an entertainment perspective, if you're on these like, 2-3 month rotations, like, are you downloading shows on an iPad on Netflix to watch? Like, you can't be busy like all the time, right?
For Ukrainians?
Yeah. For Ukrainians.
I mean, so it depends. So the guys who go to Zero Line, the infantrymen, I don't think they've got tablets. I mean, I think they probably have phones. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But again, not much connectivity. It's a lot of jamming. So they're probably not watching much. I don't know, though. I'd have to ask. I mean, obviously, guys at command posts, right? Everything's available. So if you're a couple of kilometers past the front line, right, you can play video games, you can see Netflix, all those kind of things. And sometimes you go into like a battery command post, and they'll have like Delta up on one screen. They'll have like an Xbox on another screen, right? So you can do both, which is not dissimilar to what I did during one of the deployments on ship. So it's a mix of things, but yeah. I mean, again, I think they do very similar things that like U.S. military or UK military do downrange. So.
Well, if anyone wants to write a review of Battlefield 6 from the perspective of someone fighting in Ukraine, I would be more than happy to run that article. Rob, Shashank, Tony, this was a pleasure. I would love to do this again soon. I learned a ton.
Thanks, Jordan. Thank you, Rob. Great to chat.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.
So I pushed some more deep cut questions all the way to the end of this episode so the normies wouldn't be turned off. And then we're going to close this episode with a song from a Spotify playlist made by some soldiers on the front in 22, which featured Leon Bridges, of all people.
Rob, do you have a sense of why smoke has not been more effective as a defensive mechanism? I mean, the majority of these UAV strikes are still manually guided. Even in the minority of those that are have some kind of autonomous terminal guidance, they're still electro-optical sensors, right? They're effectively cameras looking at a target, comparing it to an image, and homing in. And we know also that certainly on the Russian side, there's years and years of investment in smoke platoons, obscurants, including obscurants that can stop kind of multispectral imaging. So there's a long history of using smoke to block detection observation. Why has that not done more? Is it because there's enough persistence in UAVs to loiter around the target until smoke clears, or is it something else?
So, I mean, they did try it. I mean, the Russians did use it in 2023, 2024. And there's some examples of them trying. I think they're about a year ago, they did deploy a lot of smoke. I think it's just, we're talking, very large areas. I guess creating a cloud that dense, so such a big area is just, too difficult. Again, FPVs, a basic FPV, it depends on terrain, will get you 20 kilometers of range, maybe more. Obviously, they're operating further behind the front because of the risk on both sides. But, if you identify armor at distance, and again, keep in mind, the front line, every command post Ukraine has, they have constant Mavic feeds, right, scanning across the front line. All these feeds are shared through the Veja kind of platform for a Delta. And so every kind of command on the front line can see all their UAVs, all their adjacent UAVs. And in reality, most parts of the front line, there are only a couple main avenues of approach, and you have Mavics constantly scanning for that area. And so if you have any kind of like company of armor kind of moving, they're going to kick up a lot of dirt most of the time. It's usually pretty easy to see this at 10 kilometers beyond the front line. And so the question is, can you use smoke to cover that much of the front line, right? Or that much of an area? And I think it just becomes kind of quite difficult. But I haven't asked enough in detail about that, so it's kind of an amateurish response. But in some cases they try things, it doesn't work, and then they just keep kind of evolving in a different direction.
So to go back to one thing you said, Rob, you mentioned Ukrainian engineer sections are kind of running the robotic logistics here. One, is that true? And secondly, like, how does that, obviously that's not what American engineers do. It's not what Western engineers are traditionally responsible for. How do they come about to that?
Sure. So keep in mind, a lot of this is improvisation. So in some cases, the best of them night bomber UAV is the Vampire, made by a company called Skyfall, a really big Ukrainian company. I know of units that basically they knew some of the company, so they got some of them for free, and so they created a night bomber section in their unit, right? So a mortar battery has some, and operates them. Sometimes engineers will operate. It kind of depends how to get these equipment. A lot of times, the Ukrainian strike drone UAV battalions within brigades, some of them will focus more at FPVs, some will focus more on night bomber UAVs. It often depends on just like what was their initial source of support, where did it come from. They kind of develop the organization as a way of that way. So it depends on unit. 3rd Assault Brigade had a UGV company, and in each infantry battalion, they had a UGV, I think, like section or guys who operate the UGVs in support of that battalion. And so the company itself is mostly for maintenance, R&D, and other kind of systems. The infantry battalions would kind of maintain and operate, would operate the UGVs themselves. This one brigade, I think simply, it's partially because for Vampires, they use it for remote mining too. And so you drop mines in these areas, but also, for logistics. And if you've got a night bomber UAV, you're going to use it for whatever's needed. Then you're going to use it to support guys however they can. In this case, this brigade I knew, like the UGV, I forgot how they got it, but it was kind of random. It wasn't like, government provided as part of the, the TO&E or some along those lines. So it's not clear exactly, structurally how they're going to go. I think in a lot of strike drone battalions, they're trying to form a third company that will be a UGV company. In other brigades, I think it's kind of formed a little differently. So it's not clear exactly what they're going to do long term. And then, some of the unmanned systems forces, like K2, this strike drone regiment becoming a brigade, they have an entire battalion for UGVs. And so I guess they're supporting units that have the front line. I haven't spoken to them, so I'm not exactly sure. So I think they're still kind of figuring that one out. But in this case, like anything else in this war, you have supporting infantry is the kind of main task. And so lots of times, regardless of where you had guys in a brigade, it's like the engineer, company, you might have sappers and different kind of professionals, but ultimately it comes down to what do we need the most? And we need guys to get logistics to the front line. We need guys to do this and that. And so then they out of necessity, they become a UGV team or a UAV team or whatever, and kind of had to kind of adapt as a result of the circumstances.
When you have these larger organic drone units, so not just a UGV section to an infantry battalion, but like, wholesale company or above drone units, how do their comms and culture relate to traditional units? Because that's a concern often in Western militaries of if the enablers don't integrate at the lowest level, commanders won't understand how to use them.
You mean within a brigade or what exactly?
Yeah, so within a brigade, because I know, Ukraine is kind of set up its own robotic force, right? So how do the two units mix together in a way that commanders can properly communicate?
So Ukraine they have a separate branch called Unmanned Systems Forces. That has some units that are operationally part of it. Although I think they're also taking responsibility to basically develop TTPs, equipment, training standards for all kind of unmanned capabilities. Within every brigade, you typically have a strike drone battalion, and also now maybe a UGV component within that battalion. That element is subordinate to the brigade commander, so they're part of the ground forces or the Marine Corps Air Assault Force or what have you. But they are subordinate to the brigade commander. They are part of that brigade. They're not part of unmanned systems forces. That's that's how they kind of adopt it. And then also keep in mind, most infantry battalions will have a UAV platoon. And so those can vary in size, but you could have multiple FPV teams, you could have Mavic teams, sometimes even night bomber UAV teams in that platoon. And again, that is part of the brigade. It's definitely not part of the systems forces. In terms of relationship, there's some friction. So when Ukraine created this idea called a drone line that last year, and they elevated 5 of the best unmanned systems forces units. Most of these were battalions, one was a regiment at the time, and now they've all been moved to unmanned systems forces. That happened after Robert Borodny Magyar took over unmanned systems forces a few months ago. He was the leader of the Magyar's brigade. This one of these 5 units. So when they created the drone line units, they elevated them. So they were battalions. They made them to regiments, tripled or quadrupled the amount of personnel, massively increased the numbers. The problem is that these guys came from somewhere, and they ultimately came from the brigades. And so the brigades lost a lot of their best drone teams to these more elite units, and then the brigades themselves are kind of weaker off. And I think they're still trying to recover from that. But a lot of these brigades, like their UAV component is still quite weak, and the UAV battalions are significantly on the strength of what the TO should be. And so that led to some friction where the unmanned systems forces themselves say, look at our numbers, look at our efficiency. We're doing things, very effectively, which is true. But then the maneuver brigades will kind of say, well, we've lost our own organic capability to kind of defend the front line. We have to rely on units outside of us. And it would have been better if we just, basically properly maintained or manned all of our UAV battalions at every brigade. And that would be a more effective way of kind of holding the front line. So there's some kind of different disagreements there. There's disagreements over the point system too, whether the point system incentivizes, the right behavior. Because again, for a brigade, their priority is the infantry, and it's always the infantry. It's always stopping Russian assaults to protect the infantry. There's sometimes, from some of the brigades, a criticism that other units who are not responsible for the front line will actually focus more on the points as opposed to what is the best thing to stop Russian forces in that part of the front line. So there are different kind of degrees of criticism here. A little hard from my perspective to say exactly who's right. I think there's probably some truth in both of them. But look, it comes back to the same thing. Ukraine has manpower problems, and those manpower problems are across the force. And yes, infantry is the most obvious and kind of prominent one. But if Ukraine could properly manage UAV battalions and brigades, it also would be much more effective at holding the front line, preventing Russian advances. And so a lot of this comes back to just properly managing these kind of units and these kind of capabilities.
say you like the wind blowing through your hair. Well, come on, roll with me till the sun goes down. Texas sun. Say you wanna hit the highway while the engine roars. Well, come on, roll with me till the sun goes down. The Texas sun, oh yeah. Texas sun, caressing you from Fort Worth to Amarillo. Well, come on, roll with me till the sun dips low. Texas sun, Texas sun, oh girl. Texas sun. When I'm far from home and them cold winds blow, stuck out somewhere, the folks I don't know. 'Cause you keep me nice and you keep me warm. Wanna feel you on me, can't wait to get back there again. Texas sun. Texas sun. Texas sun. Texas sun. You say you like the wind blowing through your hair. Well, come on, roll with me till the sun goes down. Texas sun. Texas sun. Oh, baby, you're so gorgeous. How about you and me? Take a little trip. In the big body. Take a ride with me, babe. You by my side. How does it sound? You and I. Oh, girl. Take a ride with me, babe. You by my side. How does it sound? You and I.